Good evening, everybody. And if you don't know me, my name is on a big poster downstairs in the exhibition. And I think the first photograph was when I was about 8 years old. So now, when Noah was talking, I hadn't planned this, but she has a beautiful little passage in her book, which I read in honour of her father. My father never bought into the Nigerian system of corruption. I was blind to the virtue behind our modest home and few holidays, and I resented his frugality and non-materialism. I craved a luxurious lifestyle, but he held an intense disdain for such things. I think it's a beautiful passage and very, very extraordinary, actually. So thank you to his memory. And Noah, I thank you for your book. As somebody who was in Nigeria for many years, it has an endearing quality in many parts and most enjoyable to read. But there was much more in it for me. I call it political bravery, where political for this evening's little talk equates to power. Your bravery in writing the book exposes the pain of the child before the power of the parent, the anger of the citizen before the state, the frustration of the diasporian before the nation. So thank you. In the past 20 years, there has been much political bravery in Ogoni and elsewhere. And I salute the political bravery of campaigners, protesters, advocates, supporters. The resolution of oil and gas pollution is so simple. Turn off the tap, stop the flow, mend the leak, clean the stain, allow the earth to flourish and feed. For me, that's all. So please, everybody in this room, one way or another, has been part of this story, and I have never felt alone since I arrived home in 1994, leaving the Ogoni people in prison behind me. But there's two people that I would like to mention today, and in them everybody is remembered. They have left us now. Trocris Niall Tobin, brother of Colin, was the first phone caller to me in Lagos in '94 to offer humanitarian aid to the conflict situation in Ogoni. He has died within that 20 years. Irish Times' Sean McConnell was the first of many journalists who accommodated the Ogoni story in the Irish media. He too has left us. May they both rest in peace. Maynooth University Library has been the Ogoni voice on November the 10th for the past 4 years. Its staff, from librarian Cal Macaulay and Deputy Helen Family, with their very helpful and professional staff, have far extended the voice of Sara-Wiwa, far further than we could have dreamed. And the interesting thing is, it hasn't stopped. It seems to be going even further. Thank you. And I am so delighted to meet Graham Kay. I met him for the first time this afternoon. And it was a delight to find somebody that I could talk to about oil and its issue over the last 20 years. And even though he seems to be only beginning his study, he is already almost an expert. So Ken, I wish you the very best, because a PhD is not a joke to be undertaken. I would like to honour tonight John O'Shea. He's here, and I think everybody should know John O'Shea. John, stand up, because you were the person who began the link between Maynooth Library and myself. He won't stand up. Okay, he's from Tipperary, and I met him in a field over in the Shell to Sea campaign and the Rossport Solidarity Camp. So he was both an academic and a campaigner. And he obeyed me to the hilt. He came back, and I think the staff were all on holidays. It was July, in the Department of Sociology where he was studying. But he had the initiative to come down to the library and look for Helen, and then the rest is history. So thank you, John, and I'm absolutely delighted you're here tonight. So each anniversary, I kind of describe it as that I walk a little farther, think a little deeper, looking for some kind of a reflection or a message for the anniversary of this year. And this year it was a visit to Glasnevin Cemetery. And because I was in Nigeria for most of my adult life, my knowledge of Irish history was very poor. And I was very fortunate to stumble on a lecture on Parnell. It was the Ivy Day celebration. I didn't know anything about the Ivy Day, but I found a group of sincere people wearing an ivy leaf in memory of Parnell, who had died 128 years before. So 20 years looks very little and shows how long history can celebrate somebody. He ended his talk with a beautiful poem from Yeats, whom I know very little about too. But I found it was my message for the time of this anniversary, because it leaves us with a challenge. The leaders, the charismatic people, light up the world for us for a while, enables us to see what is wrong, and then the challenge is ours to follow where they left off. So I want to read To a Shade, where Yeats invites Parnell to come out of his grave, come back and look around Dublin, and in the end tells him to go back and sleep in peace. If you have revisited the town, thin shade, whether to look upon your monument, I wonder if the builder has been paid, or happier thought it when the day is spent to drink of that salt breath out of the sea, when grey gulls flit about instead of men, and the gaunt houses put on majesty. Let these content you and be gone again, for they are at their old tricks yet. A man of your passionate serving kind, who had brought in his full hands what they had only known, had given their children's children loftier thought, sweeter emotion working in their veins, like gentle blood has been driven from the place, and insult heaped upon him for his pains. For his open-handedness, disgrace, your enemy, an old foul-mouth, had set the pack upon him. And I love the last piece. Go, unquiet wanderer, and gather the Glasnevin coverlet about your head till the dust stops your ear. The time for you to taste of that salt breath and listen at the corners has not come. You had enough of sorrow before death. Away, away, you are safer in the tomb. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Majella. We'll now proceed to the next part of the evening, which is a reading by Sara-Wiwa. So some information about Naw, who is a really distinguished travel writer. She was born in Nigeria but raised in the UK, and she took a trip around the country of her birth in 2008. The journey resulted in her first published book, Looking for Transwonderland, Travels in Nigeria. It was published by Granta in 2012 and selected as BBC Radio 4's Book of the Week, named the Sunday Times Travel Book of the Year, and was shortlisted for the Authors Club Dowman Travel Book of the Year Award. The Financial Times nominated it as one of the best travel books of 2012, and in the same year, It was included among the Guardian's 10 best contemporary books on Africa. So Nu will read for approximately 15 minutes and then she will take questions. And the book is on sale here, and John from the bookshop is here with copies, and No is very happy to sign copies. So I'll call No Sara-Wiwa.
I think the first excerpt I'll read is near the beginning of the book, where I'm just talking about my feelings about going back to Nigeria as a child. So, as a teenager, I virtually had to be escorted by the ankles onto a Nigeria Airways flight at the start of the summer holidays, not only because I wanted to avoid all that airport angst, but also because I didn't want to reach the ultimate destination. Having to spend those 2 months in my unglamorous, God-forsaken motherland with its penchant for noise and disorder felt like punishment. I wanted a real holiday, riding banana boats in Barbados or eating pizzas by the Spanish Steps, just like my school friends. But my parents didn't have the money or the inclination for that sort of thing. We're going home, they insisted, with a firmness of people who knew better than to waste exotic travel on the very young on a regular basis. So come July almost every year, I would pack my bags and prepare to serve my annual sentence in a country where the only development I witnessed was the advance of new wall cracks and cobwebs, and where growth simply meant larger damp stains on the ceiling. Nothing ever seemed to change for the better, politically or economically, in 1980s Nigeria. I would arrive at an airport that hadn't been refurbished in 20 years. The humid, viscous air, pointlessly stirred by sleepy ceiling fans, would smother me like a pillow and gave a foretaste of the decrepitude and discomfort that lay ahead. Back then, when international flying was considered the height of sophistication, many of the child passengers were dressed as if attending a black tie event. Parents tarted up their little girls in frilly party dresses. The boys sweated it out in bow ties and dinner jackets, while armed thieves, otherwise known as government soldiers, rummaged through everyone's luggage at customs. Only in Nigeria could you see machine guns, tuxedos, army fatigues, and evening frocks together at an airport. The insane aesthetic summarised my country's vanities and bathos more clearly than anything else, and it depressed me. I wanted out. I wanted to go back to the place I called home, leafy Surrey, a bountiful paradise of Twix bars and TV cartoons and Leylandii trees, far removed from the heat and chaos of Nigeria. I was a toddler when the family moved here in 1978. It was during the oil boom, when the Nigerian currency, the naira, enjoyed close parity with the British pound, and the middle-class Nigerian life could easily be transferred to England. With plans to give us English schooling, my father settled the family in the UK while he continued to work in Nigeria as a property developer, writer, and businessman. For months at a time, our family was headed by our homesick mother. She cooked plantain and grappled with central heating and the other novelties of English life. We watched Sesame Street and scribbled naughtily on the walls when not scanning the fridge for snacks. But the luxuries of English life were not what my father had brought his children to England for. We were here to get an education, and he was terrified that we'd all gone soft, which is why our summer returns to Nigeria often, sometimes included a brutal acculturation fortnight in our village. The experience was a character-building one, in which we were forced to live without electricity, running water, and, the most egregious of deprivations, television. It was a tropical gulag. Nameless aunts and uncles would claw lovingly at our faces and mock us for not speaking our native language fluently. "Obegloa," they would deliberately ask us, cackling at our non-response. For dinner, they fed us intensely savoury dishes such as ground rice and okra soup, eaten by the light of a kerosene lamp and washed down with body temperature Coca-Cola. Then at bedtime, we provided the meals for an invisible but frighteningly audible army of mosquitoes and sandflies. By dawn, our arms were covered in itchy lumps that looked like strawberries, only bigger, and our fingernails had turned black from the nocturnal scratching of sweaty flesh. Having a cooling shower was the only incentive to get up and face the new day. But even achieving that was a chore in itself. You had to fetch the water first. We didn't have to trek all the way to the river But the jerry can still needed to be dragged from my grandmother's house 20 metres away from ours, which wasn't easy when the water weighed more than we did. Concerned that all this suffering wasn't sufficiently authentic, my father later instructed my grandmother to take us everywhere she went. We were to shadow her every move to get a true taste of village life. But she interpreted this diktat more literally than my father intended and tried waking us up for pre-dawn prayers. Faking sleep, my siblings and I cowered against the hot, sticky bedsheets as her lamplit silhouette banged against the window and called out our names. Zina, no, Tetlum, Ake, wake up. I'd never suffered such cold sweats in such a hot place. By contrast, my parents believed that without their country, they were nothing. My mother habitually referred to our Surrey residence as the house. Nigeria was home, the place where her parents and siblings lived, where her wilted energies blossomed and her pale skin toasted to its original brown. At home, she sparkled in Nigerian traditional clothing rather than battling the British winter in woolens and thick overcoats. At home, she was no longer the alienated housewife, but the madame, handing over laundry and shopping lists to the servant while she caught up with old friends. My father's patriotism was even more fervent. He carpeted our hallway in green to match the colour of the national flag, and once interrupted a crucial TV episode of Little House on the Prairie to teach me verses of the national anthem. It was a pointed stand against our Americanization, and even our passports remained resolutely Nigerian as a snub to gold-dusted British citizenship. One year, when I was 12, my father tried to instill a love of his country in his children by taking us on a road trip to see the beautiful side of Nigeria. From our hometown of Port Harcourt in the south, we travelled north into the interior. My sister, younger brother, and I sat in the back of our Peugeot 504, or Peugeot 504, as we say, while our father puffed on his pipe in the front passenger seat and hummed to Richard Clayderman, a deeply uncool classical pianist who performed covers of 1970s pop songs. Our driver, Sonny, who hated those tinkling Bee Gees and Barbra Streisand covers, drove in agonised silence through the Central Highlands. Throughout the trip, we were repeatedly reminded of how lucky we were to travel in this way. Very few Nigerians have seen as much of the country as you, my father would say, as we went to the Nkari Game Reserve, or to the new capital city of Abuja, and to Jos and to Kano. But I was too young to grasp this privilege. Fun as the trip was in part, I still wasn't sold on the country. Had someone told me then that the holiday of 1990 was to be our last in Nigeria, I would have performed cartwheels down the street. Little did I know that the reason for our future absence would be so grim. Do I have time for
Yes.
more or one more?
Two more, yeah.
Okay, so this is just a portion about religion in Nigeria, and I guess my observations on it and my feelings towards it. Yeah. So if there's a country more religious than Nigeria, then I haven't been there. According to the Bible, God made the earth in 6 days and took a rest on the seventh. But by creating Nigerians, he ensured that that was the last day off he's ever had since. 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, we call upon his services, connecting with him, singing his praises, establishing dialogue with him, an extremely loud dialogue at that. In my time in Lagos, I had heard hairdressers singing their hallelujahs at salons, or evangelical radio stations resounding in internet cafes, and bus passengers collectively breaking out into ovine choruses of Jesus is my father, he never, never fails me. Television brought little respite. Whenever the electricity miraculously flowed in Auntie Janice's house, I would flop onto the sofa to savour a football match or a music show, only to be lulled out of my square-eyed stupor by a pastor barking down a microphone at the start of the Divine Connection Hour and other such broadcasts. Nighttime was no haven either. One morning, as daylight diluted the inky sky and the humidity receded enough to allow me to finally sleep, I was woken by a man walking down the street outside, preaching the gospel at the top of his voice. Temptations of the flesh and the evils of promiscuity were his main themes. You know what for sexing? You know what for sexing? He bellowed into the cool dawn. I couldn't hear the rest of his sermon because he was sauntering down the street, allowing residents of each house to catch only portions of what he said. Had he been serious about spreading the good news, he might have chosen to stay in one place and let everyone in the vicinity hear his message in full. But he wasn't concerned about this. The act of imparting the message was his main motive, a conspicuous show of piety that bordered on the self-indulgent. All of this was evidence that God's love is spreading, Christians would say. My view of the situation was perhaps less nourishing. Years of economic struggle and political corruption seem to have focused Nigeria's attention on God more strongly than ever before. I noticed these changes in some members of my extended family. Religion anaesthetises the pain of bad transport and low wages and stuffed ballot boxes and candlelit nights. In the decade since democracy was restored in 1999, people's anger seemed to have faded into a muted resignation that shied away from staging street protests. Instead, they developed strategies to earn more money, selling items on the side or begging relatives and friends for loans and donations. But above all, they pray for salvation from life tribulations. Half of Nigeria's population, concentrated in the north, is Muslim, but among the other half, evangelical Christianity, especially the Pentecostal kind, is thriving. But not the kind of religion that's materialistic, that's spiritual. It's the materialistic kind that's the problem. So this charismatic, fundamentalist form of Christianity originated in the 1920s. Focusing on a direct relationship with God, its adherents affirm their faith through the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, a strange babble understood only by God. Their interpretation of the Bible is a more literal one, with a strong emphasis on abstaining from alcohol, gambling, extramarital sex and other vices. Charismatic Pentecostalism began to flourish in the 1980s as Nigeria tumbled into an economic abyss. On IMF orders, General Babangida had introduced a harsh economic structural adjustment policy aimed at cutting government spending and opening Nigeria's markets to imports. It ended the decadence of the oil boom years and brought on a nightmare of high unemployment and even deeper poverty for the ordinary man. Out of this emerged an educated elite with a strong, highly conservative message. These Pentecostal Christians believed that being born again, i.e. living a life of spiritual purity free from sin, one could be saved from going to hell and enjoy a healthy and successful life on earth. Pentecostals set up new churches that branched away from the colonial Catholic and Anglican churches. The preachers were entrepreneurially savvy and well qualified, often former lawyers, professors and doctors. Inspired by American televangelists, they ran their churches like businesses. Worshippers were promised that by becoming born again and making generous donations to the church, they would be blessed with health, wealth and good luck. Pentecostal ministers are seen as prophetic figures, responsible for passing on God's words to followers. They're self-styled faith healers, problem solvers, doctors and philosophers and economists all rolled into one. They offer the gospel as a cure-all for every ill, their services focusing on divine healing, exorcisms and the performance of miracles. Call it what you will, prosperity Christianity, health and wealth gospel, Nigerians are highly receptive to its message. Around 20 million people now belong to a Pentecostal church, pouring money into its bulging coffers and turning some churches into highly lucrative concerns. The ministries, some of which specialise in certain types of healing, such as finances or fertility, are run like commercial enterprises. They manufacture books, CDs, DVDs, and merchandise stamped with their own logos. These churches have proliferated like mice. A handful of large ones enjoy million-strong congregations, but the other 1,000 or so ministries are generally tiny, established by anyone who wills it. For every legitimate ministry, several are run by charlatans seeking enrichment of the non-spiritual variety. Competition for adherents is fierce, yet their wealth isn't frowned upon. My sister once came across an article in the Nigerian society magazine Ovation, titled The Jet Set Pastor, in which a wealthy church leader posed for photographers in the plush interiors of his mansion. His wealth may very well have been legitimate, but such affluence often evades suspicion because, much like in the gold-encrusted churches of 16th century Europe and South America, in the Pentecostal mind, wealth and virtue are intertwined. Pentecostal pastors are nearly always the founders of their church and the focus of attention. Thousands of worshippers gather in stadiums or convention centres to listen to their sermons. The preachers prowl and strut around the stage like R&B stars, using their charisma to spread the gospel and rouse the congregation into a frenzied spiritual orgy. The miracles they perform are something to behold. The blind can suddenly see. Sex freaks discover monogamy. Paraplegics stagger out of their wheelchairs for the first time since their car accident. In Lagos, not a week goes by without one of these evangelical events taking place somewhere. They're promoted like rock concerts and given lavishly worded pseudo-intellectual titles such as the expository and systematic revelation of victory over worry and anxiety. On the streets are countless billboards featuring these star preachers looking extremely dapper in their silk ties and boxy Italian suits with handkerchiefs poking neatly from their breast pockets. Their shiny faces stare down at me with toothy, camera-ready smiles that might twinkle if I stared at them long enough. Such stylishness seemed rather disquieting. After all, Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, or Nelson Mandela, or Mahatma Gandhi, Aung San Suu Kyi aren't renowned for their snappy dress sense. The preacher's presentation is unmistakably American in influence, though some intellectuals argue that their message of prosperity is rooted in traditional African animist religion, which has always sought material gain from the gods. Either way, many Nigerians see Christians as a fail-safe conduit to financial prosperity. Let's just stop there. Reminiscing about the time that when we buried my father. We got his remains about 10 years after he died, finally. And so we'd had his sort of mock burial in 2000, where we buried an empty coffin. And then when we got his remains, we went back to Nigeria in 2005, and then had the real burial. Okay, so now I'm with my driver, Sonny. He was my father's driver as well. So deeper into the village, the tarmac stopped and the road became sandy. The heat bludgeoned me as I climbed out of the car outside my father's white bungalow. It stood close to the unpainted, windowless church on the edge of his parents' compound. My grandfather's two-storey house towered above the surrounding bungalows belonging to some of his 6 wives, including my grandmother. All of them are dead now. Their graves filled up the compound, converting it into a graveyard of sorts. That's the tradition. We bury our dead next to our homes. My father, however, is buried in a public field in the village as a tribute to his struggle. His body had been dumped unceremoniously in a unmarked grave, after he and his 8 colleagues were murdered by Sani Abacha's regime. It had taken some years to retrieve the remains. We had to wait for democratic elections and then ask the government to locate the grave, and then finally the bones were identified through forensic tests. In 2005, my brother Junior and my sister Zina and my half-sister Simto and my uncle Owens and we prepared the remains for burial. As Junior brought out the large bag containing our father's dissembled skeleton, Zina cried out loud on the far edge of the room. Simto watched silently through her tears. I decided that the situation was only as macabre as my mind would allow, so I forced myself to lift out a long bone wrapped in newspaper. Uncle Owens, who's a medical doctor, helped us to identify and arrange each femur and fibula and metacarpal and rib, settling our minds into a more industrious mood as we assembled the skeleton. Before long, everyone was helping out. It was hard to conceive that these coarse brown objects we held in our hands were our father, a once energetic man with dark, stocky flesh. In vain, I searched for his face in the skull now resting at one end of the coffin. The 2 front teeth were missing. How and why, I don't know, but when Junior placed a pipe between the upper and lower jaws, his teeth metamorphosed into that familiar smile. My father was always the one who made the decisions in the family, but now we were taking charge of him, deciding the fate of his remains. When I think of the day he showed me the architectural drawings of the bungalow we were in 20 years previously, I doubt he ever imagined we would be using one of the rooms as a temporary morgue. It now made the house uninhabitable in my view, and I certainly wasn't going to spend the night there by myself. So my grandparents' compound was outside. My grandparents' compound was silent and empty, except for the odd goat and sporadic children's game. I was used to visiting Banner with one or both of my parents in the days when the machinery of hospitality seemed to grind into action of its own accord. But now that I was on my own and my grandparents were all dead, there's no one to greet me or feed me. And as I pottered around, examining all the graves, I recalled my cousin Kitiwe once telling me that she felt little reason to visit Banner now that our parents were gone.
Noah, thank you very much for that wonderful reading, and I think we got a good sense, a very evocative sense of returning to Nigeria. And it's interesting in this university, we have so much association with theology, Christianity, etc. Very interesting insight into Christianity, modern day Nigeria. And also the burial of your father. And I remember Dr. Owens-Wiwa, and some of you were here 2 years ago. Owens is Noah's uncle and Ken's brother. He wrote a book, The Politics of Bones, about the retrieval and identification of the remains of his brother and the Ogoni Nine. So certainly that resonated for me. So thank you very much for all that. Now I'm going to throw the floor open for questions, which Noah is happy to take. Yeah,
So, I'd just like to ask a question. Do you think you found it in your heart to forgive what happened to you so unjustly and so young, your father? Have you found it in your heart to forgive and to move on, or do you think it's still something that's in your own life holding you back, perhaps?
No, I mean, I sort of struggle with the concept of forgiveness. I don't really quite understand it. You know, if the perpetrator hasn't asked for it, then why am I giving it? I don't really, you know, I mean, I've moved on, you know, in that sense. I feel sorry for Sara-Wiwa, you know, and he's dead now, but you know, his name is totally reviled, and you know, and I think that's punishment enough. And you know, his family, any members of his family who aren't repentant either, you know, I wouldn't wish to walk around with the name of Abacha. So, you know, I think, you know, the fact that so many people mourned my father's death, you know, all around the world there was outrage, and you know, for me and my family that was really, it was really helpful. You know, had he just been murdered, and in the way so many people are, and his life not celebrated or you know, discussed in any way by people, then yeah, it would have felt very, very difficult. But I feel you know, that his death and the death of his colleagues, you know, wasn't in vain, and you know, we had some you know, results that have come from it, and so, you know, and I'm so proud of him. It's amazing I can be here in a small town in Ireland, you know, and have so many people, you know, come here and you know, wanting to celebrate his memory, and you know, and to have Maynooth University go to so much trouble to you know, maintain his legacy, and you know, I'm so grateful for that, and it takes the sting out of his death, you know. And my father knew the risks he was taking, and that also helped. You know, he knew what he was getting himself into. It was something that had to be done, and so, you know, in the face of all of that, you know, Sara-Wiwa means very little. It's you know, and my family aren't just the victims. It's, you know, the whole of Nigeria, you know, is the victim of this, and so, you know, the pain is shared all around. And so, yeah, I don't forgive them. I don't think they deserve it, but you know, I'm not bitter.
The first two readings you did, I think, are very true of the Nigerian community in Ireland as well. But to go back to the first one, the process that was interrupted so crudely in 1990, lots of families have that issue in Ireland now, like children saying, "No, mother, you're Nigerian, I'm Irish." Like, how do you think the question would have resolved, say, a few years later? You know, if it hadn't had to have been stopped by history, how would your family, or how would you have dealt with, "Mother, you're Nigerian, I'm..."
Well, I mean, I guess I'm different from the Irish Nigerians in that, you know, I've always identified as Nigerian. I mean, I didn't even get a British passport until I was 20. I didn't apply until I was 20. So, it's I don't know, it's a very difficult subject. You know, I get people who tell me you're British and that's it. And I get really angry because, you know, I was born in Nigeria. I have a Nigerian name, I have Nigerian parents, grandparents. I can't cut myself off from all of that and just be British, especially when, you know, surveys say that 50% of white British people don't believe that people like me can ever be truly British. So, you know, and my parents, you know, they taught us that. They said, you know, you live in this society, you're going to have to work 3 times as hard as everyone else. You're not going to be completely accepted. You know, you just have to, you know, knuckle down and get on with it, and don't lose touch with your roots. And you know, so that's how it is. And I think when I was growing up, a lot of Nigerians would say to us, "Don't go thinking you're British." And it's interesting that that's now suddenly switched. And you know, there's this sort of, I don't know, people can be quite territorial and, you know, want to push out us diasporans and then, you know, deny us our heritage and whatnot. So, you know, I mean, I think you can be both. Obviously, quite a lot of my values and my outlook have been influenced by growing up in Britain. But, you know, once you're a Nigerian, you can't stop being Nigerian. I'm just both, and I have 2 passports as well. So that's it really. If people want to argue with it, it's, you know, that's their problem. You know, there are lots of Nigerians who, you know, quite happy to identify as British and leave it at that. But I just find that very difficult, because if I were to say, well, I'm just British, then any discussion I would have about history, for example, it would just sound very weird. It would be like, oh yes, when we enslaved the Africans. I just can't do that, you know. It just doesn't make sense. And, you know, perhaps those white English people who don't believe I'm British, maybe that's their same rationale, I don't know. But, no, I mean, I just can't. I'm not happy to, you know, struggle both. But if, you know, people want to identify as just purely Irish, then let them, you know. If they don't feel remotely Nigerian, it can be quite stressful, you know, to force people to identify with a country or heritage that, you know, they're completely feel alienated from. So, you know, it's very fluid. So I think when you talk to lots of diasporans, you'll just find, you know, several different answers to that question. But, you know, for me, I'm just a Nigerian who's raised in England. That's it.
Thank you very much. On this 20th anniversary, can you honestly say that your father's fight was not for nothing and that his pilgrimage was not in vain?
I think when it comes to legacies, you know, and there's no real cut-off point. Where do you decide that something has had a good effect or not? You know, so if you look at the Iraq War, you know, people were very triumphant, you know, the year after Saddam Hussein's captured, you know, saying, oh look, you know, we were completely justified, and then now it's complete shambles, you know, and so, you know, the same can be said for the situation in Nigeria. I think, you know, there've been a a lot of improvements as a result, but obviously not as much as we would like. But I think it's too soon to say to conclude what impact my father and his colleagues had. I mean, what I do know is that I think since his death, on TV and in magazines, you would see companies like Shell and other multinationals. They would change their advertising strategy. They were, trying to promote themselves as being more green, and that sort of that culture of corporate responsibility has really increased. And I think my father's campaign helped to spark a lot of that. I think within Nigeria, it's given Ogonis a voice, which is a really big deal. In the early 90s, when you didn't have the internet or social media, for a community like the Ogonis, it was so small, it was so marginalised within Nigeria, never mind the world. For us to have a voice was just unheard of, And I think that's one of my father's greatest achievements, was to put us on the map, because you would tell Nigerians, you were Ogoni, and they didn't even know what that was, they'd never heard of it. And so, for him to take his education, to be able to go to a good school on a scholarship when he was a child, and then go on to the best university in Nigeria, it gave him access to the wider world, and and he met Anita Roddick as a result, and people like Sister Majella, who were then able to let the world hear those Ogoni bells, and that's massive, and it's really given Ogoni people, it's mobilised them in a way that it was just inconceivable in the 60s. That we take it for granted now. That people protest and ask for what they want, but for a long time people just accepted their lot, and I think that sort of that protest mentality, coupled with social media now, has really transformed Nigeria. People are much more vigilant. They're watching the government. They're watching politicians. They're recording everything on mobile phones. And I think all of this has, helped to make our democracy more of a real democracy. And my father played a large part in that. And now, when you go to Ogoni, you've got so many people from the global community. You've got scientists, you've got journalists, you have human rights activists, all carrying on my father's work, and doing it much better than I ever could. And that's wonderful. It's like, thanks to him and his colleagues, we now have loads of people from around the world taking on his struggle. And so, fine. It's the UN declared that there had to be clean-up operation. I mean, to have that in itself is amazing. To have the UN say that. Obviously, the Nigerian government did nothing about it for years, and our new president, Buhari, has just recently promised to set aside funds for this clean-up. So right now it's all words, but it's better than nothing. And if he comes good on his promise, then that will be a real testament to my father's legacy. So fingers crossed.
It's been fascinating and an honour listening to you. I'm from the west of Ireland, and we've been fighting Shell for the past 15 years. And I don't know whether you are aware or not that the BBC journalist John Egan, who I believe was the first foreign journalist to interview members of your family after the judicial executions, is now a director of Shell E&P Ireland Limited. I wonder, now I don't have a list of the names with me. We were outside Shell's HQ this morning, and for the past few hours bearing 9 crosses with the names of the Ogoni 9. And I wonder, would it be possible to ask you to read out their names, because while I would pronounce them, you know, with my own pronunciation. If an Ogoni person such as yourself, the daughter of Ken Saro-Wiwa, could just read out the 9 names.
You got the list?
Yeah, a lot of these families, some of my father's colleagues, they have quite, you know, young families, even younger than my father, and, you know, like some of their firstborn, like, you know, my brother had to give up what he was doing and move on to other things, but, you know, there are other families where, you know, the eldest child had to, you know, give up university, you know, to look after their younger siblings. There's no... So I'm not getting any reception on my phone.
Perhaps we'll take a question from Evelyn Conlon and we'll maybe try and come back to that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should have had the list with me.
Yeah.
I just thought of it.
Okay. We'll come back to, or Carl will try on his phone there. Evelyn Conlon.
Good evening. I just wanted to welcome you to Ireland and to tell you that actually, maybe to your own surprise, some of your writing is actually very witty. Because we certainly would feel that we would have a lot in common. There would be a lot of Irish people who would have been brought from London over to Connemara or Monaghan or the like of it for the summer, and they do exactly the same as you were in your village. And they would have been leaving the grand suburbs of London and they were being put out onto the farms and told to learn how to be an Irish person. It's also a very interesting thing, I think, and I'm quite astounded by your capacity to see how the wealth of what your father and his colleagues gained, that you can see that without, as you say, being bitter. And it's also interesting that you know the difference between forgiveness and not being bitter. And I would like to actually thank you very much for this evening.
Oh, thank you. So Saturday Dobe, Nodu Eo, Daniel Boko, Paul Levura, Felix Mate, Barry Bobera, Barry Len Kyobel, and John Gwime.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to roll on.